let's go back to the beginning. One of the things about the book that's amazing is that it's not about the Bush administration. And if there are any villains in this book, I'm talking about Scott's new book, if there are any villains, they include Sandy Berger, the National Security Advisor, and Madeleine Albright. And basically what this book does, and there's been so much talk, I know we're going to have to deal with it eventually with the New York Times and all the problems there, but one of the things that's breathtaking about this book, in terms of, as me, I've always been a newspaper guy, is the amount of news stories and new information. Scott's describing in more detail and with named sources, basically a 2 or 3 year run of the American government undercutting the inspection process. And essentially, I think it's fair to say, and the question I would ask is, in your view, all during those years, 91 to 98, particularly the last 3 years when everything got so intense, was the United States interested in disarming Iraq rather?
Well, the fact of the matter is the United States was never interested in disarming Iraq. The whole Security Council resolution was geared, that created the UN weapons inspectors and called upon Iraq to disarm, was focused on the one thing and one thing only, and that is a vehicle for the maintenance of economic sanctions that were imposed in August 1990, linked to the liberation of Kuwait. We liberated Kuwait. I participated in that conflict. And one would think, therefore, the sanctions should be lifted. The United States needed to find a vehicle to continue to contain Saddam, because the CIA said, all we have to do is wait 6 months and Saddam's going to collapse on his own volition. That vehicle is sanctions. They needed a justification. The justification was disarmament. But understand that. A Chapter 7 resolution of the United Nations Security Council calling for the disarmament of Iraq and saying in paragraph 14 that if Iraq complies, sanctions will be lifted. Within months of this resolution being passed, and the United States was a drafter and voted in favor of this resolution, within months, the President, George Herbert Walker Bush, and his Secretary of State, James Baker, are saying publicly, not privately, publicly, that even if Iraq complies with its obligation to disarm, economic sanctions will be maintained until which time Saddam Hussein is removed from power. That is proof positive that disarmament was only useful insofar as it contained through the maintenance of sanctions and facilitated regime change. It was never about disarmament. It was never about getting rid of weapons of mass destruction. It started with George Herbert Walker Bush, and it was a policy continued through 8 years of the Clinton presidency, and then brought us to this current disastrous course of action under the current Bush administration.
One of the things that's overwhelming to me was, and as a journalist, was the notion that everybody believed before March of '03 that Saddam had weapons. This is just an urban myth. The fact of the matter is that in my personal experience, and this, I ran into Scott when, about 98, 99, and in talking to people who worked on the UNSCOM and also in the International Atomic Energy Agency, which did a lot of very first-rate reporting, and you know some of the people who wrote some of the reports, former intelligence agents from Britain, among others, they were pretty much clear by '97 that there was very little likelihood that Saddam had weapons. And there were many people in our State Department, our Department of Energy, in the CIA who didn't believe there were weapons. And I think history is going to judge what I can almost call mass hysteria we had about Saddam and weapons. And one of the questions that keeps on coming up now is, why didn't Saddam tell us? Did he tell us?
Well, of course he told. Look, let's be honest. The Iraqis were obligated in 1991 to submit a full declaration listing the totality of their holdings of WMD, and they didn't do this. They lied. They failed to declare a nuclear weapons program, they failed to declare a biological weapons program, and they underdeclared their chemical and ballistic missile capabilities. Saddam Hussein intended to retain a strategic deterrent capability, not only to take care of Iran, but also to focus on Israel. What he didn't count on was the tenacity of the inspectors. And very rapidly, by June 1991, we had compelled him into acknowledging that he had a nuclear weapons program, and we pushed him so hard that by the summer of 1991, in the same way that a drug dealer who has police knocking at his door flushes drugs down a toilet to get rid of his stash, so they can tell the cops, "I don't have any drugs," the Iraqis, not wanting to admit that they lied, flushed their stash down the toilet. They blew up all their weapons. and buried it in the desert, and then tried to maintain the fiction that they had told the truth. And by 1992, they were compelled, again, because of the tenacity of the inspectors, to come clean. People say, why didn't Saddam Hussein admit being disarmed? In 1992, they submitted a declaration that said, everything's been destroyed, we have nothing left. In 1995, they turned over the totality of their document cache. Again, not willingly, it took years of inspections to pressure them, but the bottom line is by 1995, there were no more weapons in Iraq, there were no more documents in Iraq, there was no more production capability in Iraq because we were monitoring the totality of Iraq's industrial infrastructure with the most technologically advanced, the most intrusive arms control regime in the history of arms control. And we knew that while we couldn't account for everything that the Iraqis said they had destroyed, we could only account for 90 to 95%. We knew that A, we had no evidence of a retained capability, and B, no evidence that Iraq was reconstituting. And furthermore, the CIA knew this. The British intelligence knew this. Israeli intelligence knew this. German intelligence, the whole world knew this. They weren't going to say that Iraq was disarmed, because nobody could say that. But they definitely knew that the Iraqi capability regarding WMD had been reduced to as near to zero as you could bring it, and that Iraq represented a threat to no one when it came to weapons of mass destruction.
But you were very worried all the way through the end about what you call the concealment mechanism. Why don't you tell the audience about that?
Well, the concealment mechanism, I mean, you know, here's the thing. Hussein Kamal, the son-in-law of Saddam Hussein, defects in August of 1995. And he's debriefed by the CIA, by British intelligence, and by UN weapons inspectors. And his debriefing on all three occasions is consistent on two things. One, all weapons had been destroyed. Hussein Kamal repeated this over and over and over again. There's nothing left in Iraq, he said. But then he talked about what happened in 1991, and he said, yeah, Saddam's bodyguards, the Special Republican Guard, the Special Security Organization, they were hiding weapons back then, and they're still hiding documents and components today. And you need to go after these guys. And so that's what we did. I mean, you know, we had been lied to by the Iraqis in 1991. They had a mechanism in place then to hide things from us. The Iraqis have come clean about the fact that they hid things and where they are, but they never talked about how they hid it. And now we're being told that it's ongoing today. So now we have to investigate what occurred in 1991, who did it, and then we have to make sure that it's been disbanded and that they're not doing it today. Unfortunately, that means going after Saddam Hussein's security. This is like the Iranians coming in and telling the United States that we want to investigate the Secret Service and how they protect the president. There's no way Americans would let that happen, and there was no way the Iraqis were going to bend over and let us come in and inspect Saddam Hussein's security forces.
The other element in all of this, of course, is that, as Scott writes about, there were things going on inside his own organization that he didn't know about, operations being run by the CIA, and in effect, I think it's not an overstatement to say, in your book, in your belief anyway, and by the way, I can say that as a journalist I've independently talked to people and verified much of this, all of it. One of the things that was going on is as we provoked Saddam and demanded to get into, as your group did, the UN did, demanded to get to the palaces, their concern was, of course, that the real meaning and the real effort was to assassinate him. And lo and behold.
Well, that's exactly what happened. I mean, look, the American policy was regime change. At first, they wanted to be passive. We're just going to contain Saddam through economic sanctions, and he's going to collapse on his own volition in 6 months. That failed. We're going to put pressure on the Iraqis, and we're going to get some Sunni general to apply the 75-cent solution, the cost of a 9mm bullet put in the back of Saddam's head, and a Sunni general will take over. If you want proof positive about the corrupt nature of our regime change policy, understand this. It wasn't about changing the regime. It wasn't about getting rid of the Ba'athist Party or transforming Iraq into a modern democracy back in the early 1990s and it was about getting rid of one man, Saddam Hussein. And if he was replaced by a Sunni general who governed Iraq in the exact same fashion, that was okay. And that shows the utter hypocrisy of everything we did. But the CIA was having a difficult time getting near Saddam because he has this outstanding, and I don't mean that in terms of a bunch of good guys, but a very effective security apparatus.